She once looked at me with a tired sigh and said, "Physical touch feels like work." That was the moment I realized everything between us had shifted, and from then on, every second we spent together felt like a countdown to the inevitable. By the time I decided to walk away, I didn't just leave her behind. I made sure she would no longer hold the place she thought she had in my life. You might think that sounds harsh, but when you've given every part of yourself only to be treated like a burden, reclaiming your peace becomes your only option. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When I first met Valerie, she struck me as someone who lived with a spark in her eyes. We were introduced through mutual friends at a small gathering, and while everyone else seemed preoccupied with loud laughter and stories that had been told countless times before, she and I found ourselves in a quiet corner, talking about books, films, and the little things that made life colorful. She had this calm voice, a little raspy but warm, and I found myself hanging on every word. The way she leaned in as she spoke, as if every thought was an intimate confession, pulled me into her orbit almost instantly. At that time, I wasn't looking for anything serious. My life was steady but uneventful. I worked as an analyst for a mid-sized firm, lived alone in a modest apartment, and filled my evenings with gym sessions and weekend hikes. I thought I was content, but meeting Valerie cracked that surface of routine and showed me what it was like to feel an unexpected jolt of excitement again. In the early days, things felt effortless. Valerie laughed at my dry jokes, asked questions that made me think, and never made me feel like I had to perform to keep her attention. When we started dating, she showed affection freely, little squeezes of my hand as we crossed the street, kisses on the cheek when I wasn't expecting them, and her head resting on my shoulder during late-night drives. These gestures may sound small, but for me, they were monumental. They were signals that I wasn't just another placeholder in her life, that I was someone she genuinely wanted to be around. I remember one particular evening, sitting together on my balcony with a bottle of wine, when she looked at me and said, "I feel safe with you." At the time, it was the most grounding compliment I had ever received. Back then, I believed we had stumbled onto something rare. We both enjoyed simplicity, quiet dinners at home, long conversations, and the occasional weekend getaway. Valerie wasn't the kind of person who demanded extravagance or constant attention, and that balance suited me. My friends would joke about how fast I was falling for her, but I didn't care. To me, it didn't feel like falling. It felt like landing exactly where I was supposed to be. That's why what happened later felt so disorienting. The change wasn't immediate, nor was it obvious. It crept in like fog rolling across a field, slow, almost invisible at first, until suddenly everything looked unfamiliar. It started with subtle hesitations. Where Valerie once reached out to hold my hand without thinking, she began keeping her arms folded or buried in her pockets. Where she once leaned into me during movies, she now sat a few inches away, fidgeting with her phone. At first, I brushed it off. People go through moods, I told myself. Maybe she was stressed from work, or maybe she just needed space. But then came the night that burned into my memory, the night she uttered those words that I still can't forget. We were sitting on the couch after dinner, a simple evening like countless others, and I leaned in to hug her. Instead of relaxing into my arms, she stiffened, pulled back slightly, and said, almost mechanically, "Physical touch feels like work." For a moment, I thought I misheard her. The phrase sounded so clinical, so detached, that it didn't seem possible it had come from the same woman who once kissed me under the rain and told me she felt alive in my embrace. I asked her what she meant, and she shrugged, eyes glued to the TV, as if she hadn't just detonated a bomb in the middle of our living room. That single sentence echoed in my head for days. I replayed our past interactions, searching for clues, trying to pinpoint the moment where warmth turned into obligation. Was it something I did? Had I failed to notice her pulling away sooner? The confusion twisted into frustration, and the frustration into a quiet anger that I carried like a stone in my chest. Because it wasn't just about the absence of touch, it was about what her words represented. They told me I had shifted from someone she cherished to someone she endured. Still, I tried to hold on. I suggested open conversations, asked her if something deeper was bothering her, even offered to take breaks if she needed time alone. Each attempt was met with vague answers or silence. It became clear that Valerie had already checked out emotionally. She just hadn't admitted it to herself yet. But I felt it every time I reached for her hand and found nothing but resistance, every time I leaned in and was met with a sigh instead of a smile. That was the beginning of the unraveling, the fracture that turned into a canyon between us. And though I didn't know it at the time, her dismissive phrase wasn't just an offhand comment. It was the first domino that set everything else in motion. Before Valerie ever entered my life, my world was defined by a sense of stability that I both appreciated and resented. I was 32, working as a financial analyst at a firm in Millhaven, a bustling mid-sized city known more for its corporate towers than any sort of cultural vibrance. My days followed a precise rhythm. I woke up at 6, hit the gym for a quick workout, showered, dressed in neutral suits, and rode the train downtown to the office. The fluorescent lights and never-ending spreadsheets became the backdrop of my existence, and though I excelled at my job, the satisfaction it gave me was surface level at best. People saw me as dependable, detail-oriented, and calm under pressure, traits that made me a valuable asset to the company, but also made me invisible outside of it. My apartment, located on the 10th floor of a modest complex, mirrored my personality at the time. Orderly, functional, but lacking warmth. The walls were painted an uninspired beige, the furniture simple and utilitarian, and the decorations limited to a handful of framed prints I had picked up at a clearance sale years before. There was nothing there that told a story about me, nothing that suggested my life was full of depth. My neighbors knew me as the quiet guy who nodded politely in the hallway, never the one to join the rooftop barbecues or holiday parties. I convinced myself I was fine with that. After all, solitude wasn't loneliness if you chose it. Or at least, that's what I repeated to myself whenever the silence of my apartment started to feel too heavy. I had friends, of course. College buddies I saw once every few weeks for beers, co-workers with whom I shared occasional banter in the break room, and a cousin who lived across town and checked in on me now and then. But none of these relationships demanded much of me, nor did I demand much of them. I preferred things that way. Low stakes, predictable, free from drama. Yet underneath that preference was something I didn't like to admit. A fear of vulnerability. My last serious relationship had ended years earlier when a woman named Jenna broke things off, telling me I was present but not really there. Her words stung because they were true. I had built walls around myself, convinced that keeping emotions at bay was the only way to avoid being hurt. So when I look back now, it's easy to see how Valerie's arrival disrupted the carefully balanced, if stagnant routine I had carved out for myself. Before her, my weekends were spent hiking alone in nearby nature trails, earbuds in, playlists blaring, as if drowning out the sound of my own thoughts. I'd cook simple meals for one: pasta, grilled chicken, maybe stir-fry on a more ambitious day, and eat them in front of the television. Birthdays came and went without fanfare. Sometimes I treated myself to a nice dinner. Other times, I let the day slide by like it was nothing. I wasn't miserable, not exactly, but I wasn't fully alive either. Life was a series of tasks to be checked off, a routine to be managed, a set of responsibilities to maintain. My values at the time reflected that mindset. I believed in discipline, in hard work, in never letting emotions cloud judgment. My father had instilled that in me from a young age, reminding me that feelings don't pay the bills, and a man's worth is in his consistency. I had taken that advice and run with it, building a life where consistency was king and surprises were unwelcome. But beneath that veneer of control, I quietly longed for connection. I wanted someone to look at me, not as the dependable coworker or the polite neighbor, but as a person worth knowing deeply. I wanted to share my life with someone who wouldn't find my quiet habits dull, someone who might even appreciate them. That longing manifested in small ways I didn't recognize at the time. When I saw couples laughing together in cafes, I'd feel a pang of envy I quickly shoved aside. When I noticed coworkers leaving early to attend their kids' soccer games or anniversaries with their partners, I told myself I didn't need that kind of entanglement, but my heart whispered otherwise. Even my hikes, once a form of meditation, started to feel incomplete. I imagined what it might be like to share those trails with someone, to stop at the overlook and have a hand slip into mine as we gazed at the horizon. That's why meeting Valerie was so destabilizing. She came into my life at a time when I had convinced myself that my routines were enough. She embodied the warmth and spontaneity I had subconsciously craved, but never admitted. In contrast to my muted existence, she was colorful, animated, and deeply engaged with the world around her. While I planned my life around spreadsheets and gym schedules, she talked about trying new recipes, visiting art exhibits, or taking day trips just to see what was out there. Her energy exposed the emptiness I had carefully concealed beneath discipline and routine. But before all of that unfolded, before her presence rewrote the rules of my daily life, my world was predictable and unchanging. I was the man who went to work, kept to himself, paid his bills on time, and never caused waves. I prided myself on being low maintenance, yet in truth I was stuck. My normal was one of restraint, of moderation, of keeping everything in its place so that nothing unexpected could knock me off balance. That was the man Valerie first encountered, the quiet, steady, unremarkable analyst whose life looked fine on the surface, but lacked the kind of spark that makes you feel truly alive. I tell you this because it's important to understand the baseline before the conflict began. You need to know who I was and the world I lived in before everything shifted. Without that context, you might assume I was reckless, vindictive, or prone to overreaction when things started falling apart. But that wasn't the case. I was, above all, a man who valued peace, stability, and loyalty. Which is why the eventual unraveling with Valerie didn't just hurt. It shook the very foundation of the identity I had worked so hard to build. The way it all started with Valerie felt almost cinematic, as though life had been holding its breath and finally exhaled the moment she walked into that dimly lit living room where our mutual friends had gathered. I wasn't planning on going that night. I had told myself I was too tired after work, that Friday evenings were better spent recharging alone, but something nudged me to accept the invitation. Maybe it was boredom, or maybe it was some quiet instinct that knew I was standing at the edge of a change I couldn't yet see. When I arrived, the air smelled of takeout pizza and the faint musk of too many people crowded into a small space. Most of the conversations were loud, overlapping, filled with inside jokes and the kind of boisterous energy I usually found draining. Yet there she was, sitting slightly apart from the chaos, sipping a glass of wine and listening more than she spoke. I don't know if it was fate or chance, but we ended up sitting near each other when the group shifted around to play a board game. She laughed at one of my sarcastic comments. Not just a polite chuckle, but a genuine laugh that crinkled her eyes. That sound was like a spark in a dark room. I found myself paying attention to her in a way I hadn't with anyone in a long time. She wasn't conventionally striking in the sense that people turned their heads when she walked into a room, but she had a magnetism that pulled me in. Her dark hair framed her face in loose waves, her gestures were expressive, and her gaze carried a mix of curiosity and amusement, as if she were always weighing the world and finding it slightly entertaining. Later in the evening, when the game ended and people scattered into smaller conversations, I found myself next to her again. We started with small talk, work, hobbies, the usual exchange of pleasantries. But it deepened quickly. She told me she worked at a local nonprofit that focused on literacy programs for underprivileged kids. The way she spoke about her job, with conviction and quiet pride, struck me. It was so different from the detached way I often spoke about spreadsheets and quarterly reports. I asked her what drew her to that work, and she shrugged, saying, "Because stories saved me once, I just want to pass that on." Those words lingered in my mind long after the night was over. In the weeks that followed, we began seeing each other more frequently. At first, it was casual, grabbing coffee after work, joining group outings where we naturally gravitated toward each other. But soon those interactions turned into intentional plans. I asked her to dinner one Friday, and we ended up talking for hours, long after the restaurant closed, walking through the city streets like we were the only ones awake. She had this way of asking questions that cut past the surface, questions that made me pause and think before answering. "What makes you feel most alive?" she asked once as we strolled by the waterfront. It was such a simple question, yet I struggled to answer, realizing I had never really considered it. She, on the other hand, rattled off her list easily, cooking a new dish, getting lost in a novel, hearing her favorite song unexpectedly in a cafe, the smell of the air right before it rains. That contrast between us, her vivid embrace of life and my carefully managed existence, made me both uneasy and drawn to her. The beginning had a rhythm that felt intoxicating. Every text notification from her lit up my day. Every plan we made carried a charge of excitement. She introduced me to parts of Millhaven I had never explored. From tucked-away coffee shops with mismatched chairs to art galleries hidden behind unmarked doors. One Saturday, she insisted we drive out of the city to visit a farmer's market in a nearby town, and, though it wasn't something I would have ever chosen for myself, I found myself enjoying it simply because she was there, weaving her way through stalls and holding up jars of homemade jam like they were treasures. I started to see the world through her lens, where the mundane became vibrant and small details were worth noticing. I admit, part of me worried even then. Valerie had a brightness that seemed almost too much for someone like me, who was used to muted tones and predictable patterns. I wondered if she would eventually find me dull, if my quiet habits would bore her, but she never gave me a reason to think that way in those early days. In fact, she often teased me gently about my routines, calling me Mr. Reliable, or joking about how I probably had my sock drawer organized by color. But she said it with affection, not disdain, and I found myself laughing along, letting her energy disarm me. Looking back, I can see that the beginning was also laced with small signals I didn't recognize. Valerie was intensely independent, sometimes disappearing into her own world for days at a time without explanation. She would cancel plans last minute, claiming exhaustion or work stress, and while she always apologized, I noticed how comfortable she seemed with keeping distance when it suited her. At the time, I brushed it off as part of her personality. Everyone has quirks, I told myself. Besides, when we were together, she was present in a way that made those absences easy to forgive. The charm of the beginning was so strong that any red flags were painted over with optimism. Still, I remember the surge of hope that defined that stage of our relationship. For the first time in years, I felt like I was opening myself up, like the walls I had built after my last heartbreak were finally being dismantled brick by brick. Valerie was different from anyone I had ever known, and I told myself that difference was exactly what I needed. I believed we were two halves balancing each other out, her fire igniting my calm, my steadiness grounding her flightiness. It seemed like the perfect equation, and I wanted to believe it was the beginning of something lasting. What I didn't realize was that beginnings, no matter how enchanting, can sometimes disguise endings that are already set in motion, but in those first months I was blind to that possibility. All I knew was that I had found someone who made me laugh, made me think, and made me feel seen. And for a man who had lived in muted solitude for so long, that felt like more than enough. The good times with Valerie were the kind that leave behind an almost dreamlike haze when you look back at them. Moments so saturated with warmth and comfort that they seemed untouchable by reality. If the beginning of our relationship had been marked by curiosity and discovery, this phase was defined by rhythm and intimacy. We fell into a pattern of closeness that made me believe we had found something sustainable, something worth holding on to no matter what challenges might come later. Life with her during those days felt less like a disruption of my routine, and more like a natural extension of who I had always wanted to be, but never allowed myself to become. We developed rituals that stitched our days together in ways I had never experienced before. Saturday mornings became our time to explore the city. She'd wake up earlier than I did, humming in the kitchen as she brewed coffee, and then she'd drag me out to the car with her endless list of places she wanted us to visit. Some weekends it was a farmer's market, other weekends it was a quirky little bookstore or a new cafe that had just opened downtown. I had never been the type to wander aimlessly, but with Valerie, wandering had a purpose. It was about collecting little shared experiences, stacking them like building blocks for the future we thought we were creating. Evenings were our cocoon. We'd make simple dinners together. She loved experimenting with recipes she found online, and I became her dutiful sous chef, chopping vegetables while she measured out spices with a playful seriousness that always made me smile. After eating, we would curl up on the couch, her legs tangled with mine under a blanket, watching movies or talking about everything from childhood memories to half-formed dreams of travel. Sometimes she'd read aloud from a book she was enjoying, her voice soft and deliberate, and I'd close my eyes just to listen. These were the moments that convinced me I had finally found the kind of connection I had always wanted but never thought possible. One memory that stands out vividly is our trip to the coast. It wasn't planned. We were driving home from a friend's dinner one Saturday night when Valerie suddenly suggested we keep going, just to see the ocean. It was impulsive, the sort of thing that would normally make me uncomfortable, but her excitement was infectious. We drove for hours, the road stretching endlessly before us, and when we finally reached the shore, we walked barefoot on the sand, the cool night air pressing against our faces as waves thundered in the distance. Valerie ran ahead, spinning in circles with her arms wide open, laughing into the wind, and for the first time in years I let myself run after someone without thinking about consequences. That night, sitting together on the hood of my car, watching the horizon blur into morning light, I remember thinking that if love had a shape, it would look like this: spontaneous, imperfect, but endlessly alive. Valerie had a way of making the ordinary feel extraordinary. A rainy day wasn't just a day stuck inside. It was an excuse to build blanket forts in the living room, drink hot cocoa, and play old board games we found at thrift stores. Grocery shopping turned into an adventure when she challenged us to buy ingredients for meals we'd never cooked before. Even chores like laundry became less tedious with her around. She'd fold clothes while making up ridiculous songs about them, and I'd find myself laughing harder than I thought possible over something so mundane. It was in those little things, the shared laughter, the quiet gestures, the constant presence, that I felt the strength of our bond. Our friends noticed the change in me. They teased me about how much time I spent with her, how I seemed more relaxed, less rigid. My cousin, who had always accused me of living too cautiously, told me I finally looked like I was enjoying my life instead of just managing it. I couldn't disagree. With Valerie, I felt more open, more willing to let go of control. She softened the edges of my personality, and I, in turn, gave her a stability she claimed she had been missing. She once told me that being with me felt like, quote, 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 K, quote, 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 K, quote. Fearing that made me feel proud, like I had finally lived up to something greater than myself. What made those times so powerful wasn't just the joy, but the sense of hope they carried. I started to imagine a future with her. I pictured us moving in together, maybe even starting a family someday, and the thought didn't scare me the way it once would have. In fact, it filled me with a sense of anticipation. I began saving for weekend trips I wanted us to take, researching destinations I thought she'd love. I even caught myself browsing furniture catalogs, thinking about how her taste might blend with mine in a shared space. Those good times weren't just moments of happiness. They were bricks in the foundation of a vision I was building, a life where Valerie and I would grow together. Of course, when I replay those memories now, there's a bittersweet quality to them. It's painful to acknowledge how much I believed in what we had, how convinced I was that those days of joy were the baseline rather than the peak. At the time, though, I didn't see them as fragile. I saw them as proof that love could be real, that it could transform even someone like me, a man who had lived so long in muted solitude. The good times gave me something precious. They made me believe. And that belief, more than anything, would later make the fall so much harder to endure. Because once you've touched the sky, it's devastating to realize that the ground was waiting for you all along. The first warning signs didn't arrive with fanfare or explosive arguments. They crept in quietly, slipping under the surface of our seemingly happy life together, until one day I realized the air between us felt different. It started with moments that were small enough to dismiss at first. Things that I chalked up to stress, mood swings, or just the natural ebb and flow of any relationship. But over time, those small moments began to form a pattern I couldn't ignore, and what once felt like the warm glow of intimacy slowly gave way to an unsettling chill. The first time I noticed it was during one of our Saturday routines. We had gone out to a new brunch spot Valerie was excited about, a place she had read glowing reviews of online. Normally, she'd chatter on endlessly about the menu, make silly comments about the hipster decor, or share snippets of conversation she overheard at other tables. But that day, she was distant, scrolling through her phone even while I tried to talk to her. When I asked what was on her mind, she gave me a quick smile and said, "Nothing, just tired." I let it go, telling myself she had probably had a long week at the nonprofit. Yet even as I reassured myself, I felt a pang of something sharp in my chest. From then on, it became harder to ignore the shifts. She began canceling plans more often, sometimes at the last minute. A dinner we had scheduled with my cousin was scrapped because she claimed she wasn't feeling well. A movie night turned into me sitting alone on the couch while she texted friends in the other room. When I asked if something was wrong, she'd either brush it off with a vague excuse or give me a kiss on the cheek and say I was overthinking. That used to work on me. I was good at convincing myself not to make problems out of nothing. But this time, the excuses felt too thin. Another sign was her dwindling affection. Where once she had been the one to initiate hugs, kisses, or casual touches, now those gestures became rare. I'd reach for her hand during a walk, and she'd tuck it into her coat pocket instead. I'd try to wrap my arms around her while we were cooking, and she'd stiffen before stepping away with a laugh, saying she needed to focus on not burning dinner. On the surface, they seemed like minor rejections, but repeated often enough, they began to leave cracks in the foundation of my confidence. The intimacy that had once been second nature between us now felt like a chore for her, and I started to wonder if I was imagining the growing distance. The biggest red flag came one night when we were lying in bed, the kind of quiet moment that had once been our sanctuary. I reached over to hold her, and she sighed. Not a contented sigh, but the kind of exhale that carried frustration. When I asked her what was wrong, she turned her face to the wall and said softly, "Sometimes, it feels like you want too much from me." I froze, unsure how to respond. Wanting closeness from the person you loved shouldn't feel like asking for too much, should it? I wanted to ask her what she meant, but she closed her eyes and pretended to fall asleep. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind churning with questions I couldn't voice. Looking back, I realized those were the early fractures, but at the time, I rationalized them away. I told myself, every couple goes through phases. I reminded myself that Valerie had a stressful job and that maybe her withdrawal had nothing to do with me. I even wondered if I was being too sensitive, if my need for reassurance was unreasonable. But no matter how I tried to explain it, the truth was undeniable. The warmth that had once defined our relationship was cooling, and I had no idea why. Friends noticed too, though in subtle ways. My cousin asked once why Valerie hadn't come to a family dinner, and when I explained she was tired, he raised an eyebrow but didn't push further. A coworker who had seen us together before asked if we were still in that honeymoon phase, and I laughed it off, though inside the question stung because I knew the answer was no. Even small observations like that planted seeds of doubt in my mind, making me wonder if I was the only one who could sense the unraveling. One memory in particular haunts me as the turning point of the warning signs. We were walking through a local park one evening, the sun setting behind the trees, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. It should have been one of those picturesque moments where everything felt right. I reached out instinctively to hold her hand, and she pulled away, not harshly but quickly, as though my touch burned. When I looked at her in confusion, she said, "Sorry, I just don't feel like it right now." The words were simple, almost dismissive, but the way she said them cut through me. I realized then that her withdrawal wasn't random. It was intentional. And if she no longer wanted my hand in hers during a sunset, what else did she no longer want from me? These first signs, though subtle, began to erode the certainty I had once carried about us. They created a quiet tension, an undercurrent of unease that colored even our good days. Every smile from her felt slightly forced. Every affectionate gesture seemed delayed, as if she had to remind herself to offer it. I began to walk on eggshells, wondering if I was asking too much, if I should back away, give her space, lower my expectations. But the more I tried to adjust, the more it felt like I was shrinking myself to fit into a space that was rapidly closing in on me. At the time, I didn't see these moments for what they were, the beginnings of a collapse. Instead, I held on tighter, convinced that with enough patience and effort, the Valerie I loved would reemerge, that the distance was just a phase we would push through together. What I didn't realize was that the first warning signs were not passing storms. They were the cracks in the dam, and soon the flood would come. The warning signs that had been simmering beneath the surface finally began to boil over, and what once felt like little cracks soon widened into undeniable fractures. At first, I kept trying to convince myself that it was stress, that Valerie's distance was nothing more than the weight of her demanding schedule or the strain of adulthood catching up to us both. But the excuses I had leaned on so heavily began to collapse as the problems escalated in ways I couldn't brush aside anymore. It started with the intimacy issue, which had already become a fragile topic in my mind, but now it was impossible to ignore. One night after a long day at work, I tried to kiss her the way I used to, lingering, hoping she'd reciprocate. Instead, she pulled back, looking me directly in the eye, and said words that carved themselves into my memory. "Physical touch feels like work to me." The moment hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating and impossible to clear away. I stared at her, unsure if I'd heard right, but she repeated herself with even more clarity. I know you see touch as love, but for me, it's exhausting. It feels like another task I have to perform. My chest tightened, and for the first time, I felt something close to despair seep into me. Intimacy, the glue that had always held us together, was no longer something she wanted to give. I didn't know how to react at first. Anger flared, but I smothered it, afraid of pushing her further away. Instead, I nodded slowly, pretending to understand, even though the words cut deeper than I cared to admit. That night, I lay awake, feeling her body a few inches away yet galaxies apart. It was the loneliest kind of silence, the kind that comes when the person you love most in the world no longer sees giving you affection as a joy, but a chore. And from that moment, every interaction was colored by her confession. I started second-guessing myself, wondering if reaching for her hand was crossing a line, if asking for a hug would make me seem needy, if initiating a kiss would just remind her of the work she felt burdened by. The result was a tense atmosphere in our home, where every step felt like walking through a minefield. The escalation didn't stop there. Her communication, once fluid and constant, became fragmented. Conversations that used to stretch late into the night now dwindled into curt exchanges. When I asked about her day, she gave me one-word answers. When I shared something that mattered to me, she scrolled through her phone with distracted nods. At first, I tried harder, asking more questions, trying to draw her out, but the more I pushed, the more she withdrew. Eventually, I found myself falling silent too, afraid of being met with indifference. The once lively rhythm of our relationship slowed into an uncomfortable quiet, punctuated only by the sound of her fingers tapping on her phone screen, or the television filling the void. Hey, another shift was how she treated time with me. Before, she used to value our routines, cooking together, movie nights, weekend adventures. But as the weeks went by, those things seemed to hold no weight for her anymore. If I suggested a new restaurant or a short road trip, she'd dismiss it with excuses. I'm too tired. I already have plans with friends. Or worse, that doesn't really sound fun to me. It wasn't just that she didn't want to spend time with me, it was that she actively seemed to avoid it. Meanwhile, I noticed she had endless energy for her friends. She stayed out late, laughing, posting photos of dinners and nights out, while I sat at home wondering why she could give them the enthusiasm she withheld from me. That contrast stung like salt on an open wound. Finances also became a battlefield. When we first moved in together, we had a mutual understanding about bills and responsibilities, and everything was fairly split. But as her distance grew, so did her reluctance to contribute fairly. Suddenly, it was always me covering the rent when she claimed her paycheck was already stretched. I found myself paying for groceries, utilities, and even her personal expenses at times. When I finally confronted her, she snapped defensively, accusing me of being controlling and unappreciative. That was the moment I realized she didn't just see intimacy as a burden, she saw responsibility itself as optional. Then came the public humiliations. I'll never forget one evening when we were at a friend's gathering. A group conversation turned toward relationships, and one of the guys jokingly mentioned how clingy his girlfriend was. Valerie, with a smirk that felt like a dagger, chimed in, "I get it. Sometimes being touched all the time feels like being suffocated. I feel like I'm always fending him off." The group laughed, thinking she was being lighthearted, but I stood there frozen, humiliated, the butt of the joke she had made at my expense. Later, when I told her how much it hurt me, she shrugged and said, "You're too sensitive. It was just a joke." What hurt most wasn't just her words, but the realization that she no longer protected our bond the way she once did. Instead of shielding our relationship from harm, she seemed to invite others into its cracks, widening them with every careless comment, every rejection, every withdrawal. I began to feel like I was carrying the weight of us on my back, bending and straining while she walked ahead, unbothered, leaving me behind in the shadows of what we used to be. And as much as I wanted to believe we could fix things, her behavior was showing me the truth I didn't want to face. Valerie no longer saw us as a team. The intimacy she dismissed as work wasn't the only thing she was discarding. Piece by piece, she was dismantling the foundation of our relationship, replacing closeness with distance, commitment with avoidance, and love with obligation. And the more I tried to hold on, the more it slipped through my fingers. until I was left clutching at something that no longer existed. When things at home had become unbearable and my own doubts had nearly consumed me, it wasn't just my inner voice that told me something was wrong anymore. Others began to notice too. At first it was subtle, an observation here and there from people who had been around us long enough to sense the shift in our dynamic. My closest friend, Marcus, was the first to call it out directly. We had gone out for coffee one Saturday morning, something we used to do often but hadn't in a while. As soon as we sat down, he leaned back in his chair, studied me for a moment, and asked, "Man, are you okay? You don't look like yourself anymore." I tried brushing it off, blaming work stress, but he didn't buy it. He told me point blank, "I've seen how Valerie treats you. She barely looks at you when you're talking. She shuts you down in front of people. And it's like she has no respect for you anymore. That's not normal." Hearing it from Marcus hit differently because it was a reflection of what I had been silently battling inside but hadn't wanted to admit aloud. It wasn't just Marcus either. My sister, who had always been supportive of me and polite to Valerie, started to show cracks in her patience. One evening, the three of us were at dinner, and Valerie spent nearly the entire meal scrolling on her phone while my sister tried to include her in conversation. At one point, my sister asked a simple question about Valerie's work, and she gave a dismissive "it's fine" without looking up. Later, when Valerie excused herself to take a call, my sister leaned across the table and whispered, "I don't know how you're dealing with this, but she doesn't seem invested at all. You deserve someone who actually cares." I felt my face heat with a mix of shame and defensiveness. I wanted to protect Valerie, to argue that she was just stressed, that people didn't see the good moments we shared behind closed doors. But even as I formed the excuses in my mind, they sounded hollow. Then there was my mother. She had met Valerie several times, and while she was always warm and welcoming, her maternal intuition was razor sharp. During a family gathering, she pulled me aside into the kitchen and asked softly, "Are you happy, son? Really happy?" I hesitated too long, and that hesitation alone was enough to give me away. My mother sighed and touched my arm, saying, "I know love is complicated, but it shouldn't drain the life out of you. It should build you up, not break you down." Her words echoed in my head for days, each syllable carving deeper into my resolve. Even mutual friends who had been neutral at first began to voice their concerns. One night at a small gathering, I overheard someone joking about how Valerie acted single whenever she was out without me. They laughed, but the comment cut into me like a blade. If that was how others perceived her, then maybe my fears weren't exaggerated after all. Valerie wasn't just distant with me. She was projecting her detachment for the world to see. What these voices did was more than validate what I felt. They forced me to confront the reality that I wasn't crazy, and I wasn't being overly sensitive. The problems were real, visible, and undeniable. I could no longer lean on the fragile hope that things would magically improve, because too many people outside the relationship were seeing the same cracks I had been desperately trying to plaster over. It was like everyone around me was holding up a mirror, and for the first time I couldn't turn away from the reflection. The worst validation, though, came not from friends or family, but from Valerie herself. One evening, I tried once again to talk to her about us, to explain that I felt unloved and unwanted. Instead of engaging, she sighed heavily and said, "I don't know why you're making such a big deal out of this. You're acting like I owe you something just because we're together. Affection, time, whatever. It's not my job to keep you happy." The way she said it with such cold detachment stripped away the last remnants of doubt I had been clinging to. It wasn't that she was struggling quietly and needed me to be patient. It was that she no longer cared enough to even try. After that, Marcus's words replayed in my head. "She doesn't respect you anymore." My sister's voice echoed, "You deserve someone who cares." My mother's wisdom lingered. "Love shouldn't drain you." And I realized they were all right. I had been holding on to an idea of Valerie that no longer existed, if it had ever truly existed at all. What remained was someone who saw intimacy as labor, commitment as optional, and respect as unnecessary. The weight of those realizations was heavy, but strangely, they also brought with them a sliver of relief. I wasn't alone in seeing the truth anymore. The validation of others didn't fix the pain, but it gave me permission to acknowledge it. I had been gaslighting myself for so long, convincing myself that if I just worked harder, tried more, gave more, maybe she would meet me halfway. But now I understood that no amount of effort on my part could compensate for the indifference on hers. It was in this stage, with the voices of those who loved me echoing louder than the silence between Valerie and me, that I began to see the path forward. I didn't yet know exactly how I would muster the courage to take it, but the fog that had clouded my judgment was beginning to clear. And though my heart still ached with the weight of disappointment, a quiet strength was building in me, the kind that comes when you finally accept that you're not imagining things. You're living them. And with that acceptance, change becomes not just possible but inevitable. The day everything finally shattered wasn't marked by some grand explosion, but by a quiet, crushing clarity that came in the most unexpected way. For months I had been living in limbo, clinging to the slivers of a relationship that had long since stopped being mutual, but I hadn't let myself admit it fully. I kept telling myself that maybe Valerie was just going through a phase, that if I was patient enough, she'd eventually remember the love we once had. But deep down, the truth had been clawing at me, and it finally broke through when a single moment stripped away all the illusions I had been desperately trying to maintain. It was late on a Friday evening, when I returned home earlier than usual. I'd wrapped up work faster than expected and thought maybe, just maybe, I could surprise Valerie with takeout from her favorite Thai place. I carried the bags into our apartment with a hopeful flutter in my chest, imagining that maybe a good meal would soften the tension between us. But when I stepped into the living room, the sight that greeted me drained every ounce of warmth from my body. There she was, sprawled across the couch, laughing louder than I'd heard in months. But she wasn't laughing with me. She was on a video call, her voice playful and her eyes shining in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in a long time. At first I froze at the door, unnoticed, listening to her giggle and tease whoever was on the other end of the call. It wasn't the words themselves that broke me, but the tone. She sounded alive, engaged, full of joy, the very thing she had denied me for so long. The same woman who told me that physical touch felt like work, who sighed at my attempts to connect, who rolled her eyes at my conversations, was now pouring all that energy into someone else. I set the food down quietly on the counter, my hands trembling, and stood there like an outsider in my own home, realizing with painful clarity that I had been replaced, if not physically, then emotionally. When she finally noticed me standing there, her face shifted in an instant. The laughter disappeared, replaced by a cold, almost annoyed expression, as if I were an intruder interrupting her fun. She muttered a quick goodbye into the phone, tossed it aside, and crossed her arms. "Why are you home so early?" she asked flatly, no trace of guilt or warmth in her voice. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to pour out the tidal wave of hurt crashing through me, but all I could manage was a choked, "Who was that?" She shrugged, brushing me off. "Just a friend. Don't make it a big deal." But it was a big deal, and the weight of it crushed me right then and there. All the sleepless nights, all the justifications, all the second-guessing and self-blame collapsed under the reality staring me in the face. She had energy, she had joy, she had love to give, but she had chosen not to give it to me anymore. And suddenly, every moment of dismissal, every refusal, every cruel remark lined up in my memory like puzzle pieces, finally forming the full picture. Valerie wasn't just tired or stressed or overwhelmed, she simply didn't want me anymore, and she hadn't for a long time. That night, we fought. Not the usual restrained bickering that fizzled out in silence, but an eruption of everything I had bottled up for months. I told her how small she made me feel, how humiliated I had been by her jokes in front of others, how much it destroyed me when she said intimacy felt like work. She didn't meet me with tears or apologies. She met me with indifference. "I can't help how I feel," she said coldly. "I'm not going to force myself to be someone I'm not, just because you want me to." The words stung, but more than that, they revealed the truth. I had been too blind to accept. She wasn't interested in fixing us. She wasn't even interested in trying. After that night, something inside me broke, but in the breaking came an unexpected sense of freedom. The denial that had kept me chained to her finally burned away, leaving behind a raw but undeniable clarity. I saw myself for what I had become, a man begging for scraps of affection from someone who no longer valued him, clinging to a ghost of a relationship that existed only in memory. And in that clarity, I realized the cost of staying. I had been losing myself, piece by piece, dimming my own light in the hope of keeping hers alive, but she wasn't even holding the flame anymore. The following days were heavy with silence, both of us retreating further into our corners of the apartment. She carried on with her friends and her phone, while I walked through the rooms like a stranger, grieving the home that had become nothing more than a cage. The turning point came when I looked at myself in the mirror one morning and barely recognized the man staring back. My eyes were hollow, my shoulders slumped, and my spirit felt worn to the bone. That was the moment I whispered to myself, I can't live like this anymore. It wasn't anger that drove me. It was survival. Hitting rock bottom didn't feel like falling off a cliff. It felt like standing in quicksand, realizing that the more I struggled to hold on to Valerie, the deeper I sank. And so, I stopped struggling. I stopped hoping she would change. Stopped pretending our love was salvageable. Stopped convincing myself that I could be enough for someone who had already decided I wasn't. For the first time in months, maybe years, I chose myself over her. And though the choice terrified me, it also carried a strange sense of relief, like opening a window in a suffocating room. That night, I didn't tell her everything. I didn't announce some grand ultimatum or deliver a dramatic speech. Instead, I made a quiet promise to myself. I was done living in denial. The relationship I had poured myself into was over, whether I wanted to admit it or not. And from that acceptance came the determination that I would not spend another day begging for love that should have been freely given. Valerie had made me feel like physical touch was labor, like companionship was a chore, like my very presence was an inconvenience. But I would no longer be her burden. I would no longer make myself unemployed in my own heart while she invested her energy elsewhere. That was the night I knew with absolute certainty that it was time to reclaim my life. The morning after I made that quiet promise to myself felt different, like something inside me had shifted overnight. For the first time in a long while, I didn't wake up with that heavy knot of dread in my stomach. Instead, there was an eerie calm, the kind that comes when you finally accept what you've been running from. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the sunlight streaming through the blinds, and whispered out loud, "It's over." Saying it felt like a release, as though the words themselves unlocked the cage I had been trapped in for far too long. I knew then that I wasn't going to keep dragging this lifeless relationship forward anymore. I had to act. I had to follow through. I didn't rush into confrontation. Instead, I started preparing quietly, deliberately. I gathered my important documents, birth certificate, bank information, personal records, that I had carelessly left in drawers and shelves throughout the apartment. I began packing away my clothes, little by little, hiding them in the trunk of my car so Valerie wouldn't notice right away. Every trip down to the parking lot felt like smuggling pieces of myself back into freedom. At first, the process broke me. Each shirt folded was a memory. Each book stacked was a reminder of nights we had once spent together. But as the boxes filled and the drawers emptied, something else filled me in return: strength. The breaking point came one Sunday afternoon. She had gone out again with friends, posting photos of her smiling, her arm linked with others, her happiness blooming everywhere but at home. I sat at the dining table, staring at her chair across from me, and realized it had been empty for months, not physically, but emotionally. I wasn't losing her that day. I had lost her long ago, and I had been clinging to a ghost ever since. So I stood up, grabbed the last suitcase, and packed it without hesitation. When she returned that evening, she barely noticed at first. She tossed her bag onto the couch, scrolled through her phone, and mumbled, "What's for dinner?" That was when I spoke. Calm, steady, almost too steady, I said, "There's nothing for dinner. I'm leaving." Her head snapped up, eyes wide for a moment, then narrowing with disbelief. "What do you mean, leaving?" she asked, her tone defensive, as though the idea was absurd. I gestured toward the packed suitcase by the door. "I mean, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. You've made it clear that being with me is a burden, that even touching me feels like work. So I won't make you work anymore." My voice didn't crack, though my heart raced in my chest. For the first time in months, she was speechless. Then came the anger. "So that's it? You're just gonna walk away? After everything I've done for you?" The words stung, not because they were true, but because they were so far from reality that I almost laughed. Instead, I shook my head and said, "After everything I've done for you, after all the patience, the humiliation, the loneliness, yes, I'm walking away. Because I finally realized I deserve better than begging for scraps of affection." The argument escalated, her voice rising, accusing me of being dramatic, of overreacting, of abandoning her when she needed space. But the difference now was that I no longer flinched. Every time she tried to twist the blame onto me, I felt my resolve harden. I had spent too long shrinking under her dismissals, but not anymore. For once, I stood tall. Eventually, her words turned hollow, her accusations losing their bite when she realized I wasn't budging. I grabbed my suitcase, walked to the door, and with my hand on the knob, I looked back one last time. She stood there, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line, but behind the anger, I thought I saw something else. Fear. Maybe she realized I wasn't bluffing, maybe she realized the safety net of my loyalty was gone. But it was too late. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, shutting it behind me like closing a chapter I should have finished long ago. The first night away from her wasn't easy. I stayed at Marcus's place, lying on his couch staring at the ceiling, the silence pressing down on me. But this silence was different. It wasn't suffocating. It was healing. For once, I didn't have to wonder if the woman beside me wanted to be there. I didn't have to measure my worth against her indifference. The silence was mine, and it was peaceful. Marcus sat with me, no judgment in his eyes, just quiet support. At one point, he said, "I'm proud of you. You finally chose yourself." Those words mattered more than I could explain, because for the first time in so long, I felt like I had done something right. The days that followed were a blur of adjustment. I moved my things into a small apartment of my own, a modest one-bedroom with peeling paint and a noisy radiator. But it felt like a palace compared to the emptiness I had been living in. Each box I unpacked was like piecing myself back together, rediscovering the fragments of who I had been before Valerie dimmed my light. And with each passing day, the weight lifted. I noticed little things again. The warmth of sunlight on my face, the comfort of music filling the room, the laughter of friends who had never stopped caring about me even when I had withdrawn. As weeks turned into months, I reflected often on what had happened, and I came to see the lessons I needed to learn. Love should never feel like labor. Affection should never be negotiated. Respect should never be conditional. What Valerie had given me was not partnership but punishment, and what I had allowed myself to accept was far less than what I deserved. It took hitting rock bottom to finally understand that staying in the wrong relationship is far lonelier than being alone. Now, when I think about her words, physical touch feels like work, I don't hear them as rejection anymore. I hear them as the truth that set me free. Because if love with her was a job, then yes, I made her unemployed. And in doing so, I hired myself back into my own life, reclaiming the joy, the self-worth, and the peace that I had given up far too easily. I share this story not just as a record of what I endured, but as a reminder to anyone listening. You don't have to stay where you are unwanted. You don't have to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's indifference. You don't have to beg for love. If it feels like work for them to love you, then maybe the work you need to do is to walk away. Because sometimes the bravest decision isn't to keep fighting for the relationship, it's to fight for yourself. And that's what I finally did. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.